Hello, everyone. So today we're going to do some more paper hints or help, and then the second half of this video we're going to introduce Turkey and Scarf Wars, which is going to be a video I'm going to have you watch. So what I want you to do is take 4 facts from the paper information and 3 facts from the introduction to Scarf Wars, and that'll be your assignment here. Before we dive in, just quick, the thing I want to emphasize the most, you'll probably hear me say it on every video until I see it in your drafts, is that remember when you're writing this, that the thesis must be arguable and that a reasonable person could disagree with it. So if you're writing a paper about human trafficking and you say human trafficking is horrible and needs to be stopped, that's not something a reasonable person could disagree with. Instead, you could perhaps suggest a way or multiple ways that human trafficking could be stopped, and usually that'll be a way that a reasonable person could disagree with you. So that's I think the primary review I'm going to have for today. So the other thing I want to mention is make sure you have your first paper handout packet handy, right? Because there's some things in it that are extremely helpful. Like I highlighted a few that might be helpful for you. Avoiding plagiarism that we went over for the first paper, paraphrasing, how to write an introduction, examples of strong introductions. You might also want to see the examples of analysis and evaluation that we went over in class. So make sure to keep this first handout packet handy as well. So we're going to look at introductions today. And we're going to look at one that's in your handout packet, your first handout packet, and then one that's not in either handout packet to give you a general idea of what we're looking for. But first, some review from our first handout packet. So the purpose of your introduction is to introduce your topic, create interest, provide necessary but limited background information, and preview your essay. Okay, and for our purposes, I'm going to ask that you put the thesis or argument that a reasonable person could disagree with at the end of your introduction paragraph. Okay, and finally, we talked about using sound proofs, logic, that it makes a logical order, right? For our purposes, what you almost always want is your introduction to start broad, and your paragraph introduction should go and start to move narrower until it gets to the thesis, which is pinpoint, narrow what your argument is, right? So start broad and work your way narrow throughout the opening paragraph. We're going to look at one introduction that's an exception to that rule, but in most cases that'll be the rule. Also, you want to have an emotional appeal or pathos for your audience, and you want to establish credibility, which could just be using the terminology of your field to make it clear that you've read and know a lot about this subject, or it could be using quotes and citations, but in some way you need to establish your credibility. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. First, let's look at one that's not in either handout packet, just to give you a general idea. Also, you notice here, remember some of the formatting. We're not going to go over that today, and I don't expect it to be perfect on your first draft, but try to, in general, have the right heading and font and spacing, right? We'll go over formatting more next week. So here's an example of an introduction. For years, senseless killings have been done to innocent creatures for no other reason but to obtain one specific item from the said animal. So not perfect writing this is student example, but you can see that that's a very general statement that's wide, right? The animal then ends up rotting in the woods, fields of their home. Animal poaching is not only dangerous for animals, but also for the environment as well. So it starts to get more specific. People rarely think about or talk about the problem of poaching or the dangers it is putting people and the environment in. Certain animals are getting dangerously close to extinction. So that's getting very specific, right? Although not specifically naming animals, which could be an improvement on this paragraph, actually. When that happens, it rocks the entire foundation of the animal kingdom. Hunting should be preserved for a means of providing for a family, not for sport, personal gain, or to make decorations from these animal parts. Okay. So the good thing that this paragraph does is it goes from broad and moves to narrow into a pinpoint thesis. As you can hear as I was reading it, there's some grammatical and other issues with it. That's not what we're focusing on today. We're focusing on just general. And then it ends in the sharp thesis, right? So that's the good thing it's doing. The bad thing, or the thing that needs improvement, I should say, is that it doesn't name the country. It doesn't name any specific animals, right? It doesn't. So after the first paragraph, I have no idea where we are or what they're talking about precisely, right? So it needs to be much more precise and specific. It also doesn't establish a strong ethos or credibility. It doesn't use the terminology of the field or quotes or citations, right? So in general, the logos here is strong from broad to narrow, but it's missing ethos or credibility. Okay, so let's look at another example that was in your handout. Let's see, it's on page 27 of your first handout packet. Okay. Okay. Now this one goes against the logos rule for introductions, right? So in 2009, American evangelical Scott Lively headlined a Christian conference in Uganda. Okay, that's a fact, right? And you could argue it might even need citation. Actually, yes, it should have a citation now that I think about it for a moment. And it's a fact that is specific and precise. So you should not start your introduction with that. Instead, you need a broad statement to lead into that. Now, here, the author wants us to know this specific event, but lead into it. Use about 2 sentences more broad to lead into this specific event, and then it's going to work from there into a real narrow thesis. Okay. His section of the conference was about the evils of the gay agenda, and so you see the citation there to establish credibility or ethos. Other American evangelicals supported Lively, as well as the Ugandan government's endorsement of their infamous anti-sodomy laws. 1 month after the conference, so we're getting really detailed and specific now, which was presented to many people, including government officials, a new bill was introduced in Uganda. The anti-homosexuality bill would make homosexual acts committed in Uganda crimes punishable by life in prison and in some cases death. Okay, so again, very precise and using information from sources to establish credibility. And you can imagine an introduction sentence or two that would start with something about the importance of human rights to keep it general, right? And then finally, the hate speech that these people are uttering is spreading all over the world and is ultimately resulting in radical events that contradict the predominant Christian value of love thy neighbor. So again, I think on a further draft of this, argued he should take these people out because that's often a loaded phrase. But he tries to understand where a reader, or I'm sorry, it's a she. She tries to understand where the reader was coming from if they disagreed with her. And she said, hey, Christians, if you're a Christian, this goes against your main idea of love thy neighbor, right? So she's trying to reach out to an audience that she may disagree with. Okay, so what I really want you to focus on with your introduction is to use the details that I gave you on what should be included in that introduction. And then to have a balance of logos, pathos, and ethos. And focus on logos, which I want you to start broad and move to more specific in your introduction. if you're unsure how to start your paper, go through the example introductions from that first handout packet. I'm sure you can get some good ideas from that. Okay, so that's introductions. Now back to your paper 2 handout paper handout packet. If you want to know anything about the details of the paper, we have them early in the packet, right? We have your trustworthiness and format, your introduction, your thesis information here, your paragraph structure. So when you turn in your drafts this week, the 1.5-page drafts, here's what I need to see. I need to see, one, that you're getting information from scholarly works, okay? 2, that you're able to use the paragraph structure, and and a basic citation, right? That you're introducing your idea, you're adding evidence with an intro clause, you analyze the evidence, break it down. What does it mean? Why is it important? Evaluate that evidence. How does it connect to the larger subject? And that you connect back to your thesis or maintain the argument. Okay. So I need to see that you do all that. As far as a works cited, we'll be going over that probably next week. And here's the in-text citation rules as well. Okay, but if you go to page 9 in your paper 2 handout packet, you can see the instructions for it. Remember? And so you can see the examples and you can build your works cited page now. Okay, what you turn in for the 1.5 page, I don't expect it to be a perfect works cited, but I do want to see an attempt at the works cited, right? It doesn't have to look flawless like this, but I need to see most of the information there and an attempt at the works cited. Okay, I think that's all I want to go over on the paper side of things. And next week, after I have your drafts, I'll be able to give you some more specific advice. So let's move over to your introduction to Scarf Wars or Turkey. Okay, so by the way, just a quick note before I dive into this is this class that we're going through is meant to be a whole semester of in-class work, right? And if I were designing the class as an online course, it would have been very, very different, right? But it's wasn't built that way, and there's no way in the extra week we're given I could completely create an online course for 1/3 of the class. It just doesn't lend itself well. So I had to make some decisions, and a lot of this isn't going to mesh together as well as it would in class. We'd have a lot of discussions. We'd actually be able to go over a lot more material. And if I was going to cut somewhere, it was going to be on the critical thinking side, right? But I still wanted you to get a taste of what we would have explored, right? So that's why I'm having you read some text, watch some videos, but you're not getting the whole broader picture. And I apologize for that, but that's just kind of the nature of living through a pandemic and trying to make the best of things, right? So in trying to give you a taste of things, I thought a look at Turkey would be a good taste, because when most people look at the Middle East, they think of Afghanistan or Iraq, right? And those are war-torn regions and that have a lot of struggles, right? So Turkey gives you an idea of the modern side of the Middle East. And the vast majority of the Middle East is closer to Turkey than it is to Afghanistan. Afghanistan's been at wars for centuries. When you've been at war for centuries, they've been invaded by every country, you know, the U.S., the Soviets, the Ottomans, and so on, that they actually have a fighting season each year. And most of the time when you go ask Afghani soldiers who they're fighting, they have no idea. They don't know if they're fighting. They're just defending their home, right? But you can imagine a society like that isn't going to have very advanced kind of ideas, right? Now, a country like Turkey gives us a broader, different perspective. So this is just information I want you to have going into the video Scarf Wars that I'm going to have you watch. So some information, there's a lot of misconceptions about religious head coverings, right? Well, let's look at where it comes from, right? So first, a lot of people don't realize, but Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the three Abrahamic religions, meaning they come out of the same tradition, right? Now, you could argue Mormonism would be the next in that line. But traditionally, those three are looked at as the Abrahamic religions. And so Christianity views itself as a fulfillment of Judaism, just as Islam views itself as a fulfillment of Christianity and Judaism, right? And so Islamic people believe in many of the same things as Christian and Jewish people. They believe that Jesus came to save or is going to come to save the world. Matter of fact, at a place called the Jesus Minaret. They believe that he was born of a virgin birth and performed miracles, right? So there's a lot of misconceptions, and some of that is often more based in culture than it is religion. So the head covering is a good example of that. So the head covering is a cultural phenomenon. It actually came from the West, and at first what happened is Muhammad instituted it to protect his wives, right? He thought Islamic countries at that time were being invaded by the West constantly. And so his idea was that if his countries are being invaded, if these countries are being invaded, well, if we cover our women, they won't be as attractive to Western invaders, right? And so it became a cultural tradition that a lot of Islamic people practice, and it extended to it actually there was a large gap where it wasn't practiced. And then when the modern colonial era came, it became widespread again. As soon as Islamic countries are invaded, they look to this practice more. So let's look at where this comes from, right? It comes from actually the Talmud, the Bible, and the Quran, right? And so let's look at the biblical verse unveiling versus the Quranic verse unveiling. Okay, and try to see if you can see what's the same and what's different here. So the biblical verse, 1 Corinthians 11, 2-7. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For a man ought not cover his head, since he is the glory and image of God, but woman is for the glory of man. Okay, so that's the biblical verse. See who it says to cover, why it says to cover, right? And then let's go to the Quranic verse. Say to the believing man that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. That will make for greater purity for them. And God is well acquainted with all they do. And say to the believing woman that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, and that they should not display their beauty and ornaments, except what must ordinarily appear thereof. Okay, so what's that say? What's the difference or similarities here, right? Actually, I'll walk through those. So first, for the Bible, it's specific to it's gendered, right? It's gendered. It's specifically for women, right? And it's different for each gender, right? Where on the Quranic verse, first of all, it doesn't say anything about covering your head. It's not in the Quran. Covering your head is not in the Quran. There are verses on modesty. Okay? In this case, it says modesty. And what do you notice? It says, that man should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, and that women should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. It's the exact same wording for men as it is for women. They are both supposed to dress modestly. There is no commandment about the head, right? And so anything that is happening from there is not coming from the Quran. It is actually cultural beliefs. And what you find is the poorer a country, the more they've been attacked or gone to war with, the more covered women are, right? So Afghanistan, extremely covered. A place like Turkey, not as much, because they haven't been attacked or invaded as much, right? And it's because when we're attacked, when we are attacked by outside invaders, our psychology turns to tradition, to kind of a conservatism, right? It turns to our family, our friends, our local area, our religious beliefs, right? And so when you're attacked, there's always a surge towards those institutions. And so when you're pushing towards conservatism and religion, it ends up and wanting to protect the women in your country, then covering is coming about. Okay, so I said it's supposed to be equal for men and women. So this is from Saudi Arabia. You notice the men fully covered, right? And women fully covered in the abaya and the kafaya, right? And that's how it's supposed to be in Saudi Arabia. Of course, though, in practice, Saudi Arabia is like the Vatican City of Islam. It is the capital of Islam, Mecca, right? And so because it's so conservative, although the rules are supposed to be the same, they're a lot more enforced on women, right? Men can get away with more leeway, but they're still supposed to be dressed as conservatively as pictured here. And then we have the hijab. We see this in more moderate Islamic cultures, right? It's usually, or it's also often called the turban, right? And it's usually just a head covering and dressed modestly otherwise, right? And you see that in many more moderate Islamic cultures. And then here's some of the other examples: niqab, hijab, burqa, chador, and dupatta, right? And the hijab you see again in more moderate, and then dupatta still more moderate, and then by the time you're getting to niqab, burqa, chador, you're getting to war-torn places that have been invaded, are poor, and were at some point trying to protect their women from outside invaders. So you see here where each head covering is more, right? And so you see places, moderate places like Tunisia, much more on this side of the spectrum, right? You even see Egypt, which is a more conservative place, is still much more on this side of the spectrum. Turkey is a much more moderate place, and so extremely on this side of the spectrum. Now, Iraq is a more mixed feature. I have friends from Iraq who lived in cities, and before we invaded, they never had to wear a head covering. They actually had no friends who ever wore one. They did not know a person who wore a head covering. If you went away from cities into small towns, you'd see them. But in major cities and most of Iraq was not covered. After our invasion, women had to cover. Again, they were attacked. They had outside invaders. They became more traditional, more conservative, more afraid, and wanted to protect their women. And then women, post-Iraq war, my friends who have never worn one in their life have returned to Iraq and have to wear them now, right? You see Lebanon much more on this side, and then you see the conservative places, right? You see Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan would be on this side. But then look at this. This isn't just for these countries. This is the Middle East as a whole. Median, right? If you look at the Middle East as a whole, it's mostly on this side, right? It is a small minority that is on this side. Iran is another one. Yet the West, the pictures we get are this, right? We don't see this nearly as much. Also, what you'll see in the Turkey video is that it's usually a matter of choice in these moderate countries, right? So my one friend from Jordan, her sister wears one and she doesn't, and she swears, or I'm sorry, the other way around. She wears one, her sister doesn't, and she swears that her family doesn't care one way or the other, that it's kind of like wearing a crucifix in Catholicism. It's a way to show you're a faithful person, right? And so she actually, just as an aside too, I don't have it ready here, but there's actually I used to have her come to speak to my classes, and what she would do is she'd stand up at the front of the room and she'd say, American women are so oppressed. American women are so oppressed. And then have the students try to figure out who this woman wearing a hijab was and why she was saying that Americans are oppressed. Because we see the hijab and think, oh man, she must be so oppressed, right? And so she would tease it out in the discussion and eventually explain. She would say that women in America, from early age, and it's getting earlier all the time, are sexualized, are objectified, are told that their entire existence is about their looks, right? To the point that they cut up their bodies, have eating disorders, and have severe anxiety and starvation type issues, right? And her argument, this is her perspective, I'm not saying I agree with this, was that there are a lot less of those pressures for her than there are for American women. And she argued that she was better off. Again, that's just one person's opinion. Okay, so let's look at, this is a silly version, but you say, how do these cover people do anything like go swimming? And here's a good example, something called the burkini. Usually, in those more conservative societies, they just swim separately. They just, the genders do things separately. Matter of fact, my wife set up separate swim times at IUP for male and female people from Saudi Arabia primarily. But it's not unique to Islam. As I said, this root comes from the Talmud and the Bible, right? And so we see it all over the place. We see head coverings traditionally in weddings and traditionally in funerals, although we see less of that nowadays. It still is there. We see nuns, all different kinds of nuns, showing this as well. We see other Christian groups throughout other parts of the world, like Coptic Christians, who cover, right? And then we also see it in groups like the Amish or Orthodox Jewish or some Mennonite or even some other religious groups as well. Of course, it's common in non-Abrahamic religions as well. There's Sikhs up here, who is a religion who believes in pacifism, yet they were the group who was most attacked in the U.S. after the 9/11 attacks. Violence against people who were perceived to be Muslim went up 2,000% after those attacks, and the vast majority of them were Sikhs who are not Islamic at all. Okay, so what I want you to do is go watch Scarf Wars. Don't forget, for this video, I want you to do 4 facts from the paper stuff and 3 facts from the introduction to Scarf Wars. Thank you guys. I know there's a lot of work. I tried to cut as much as I could, and I really appreciate all the hard work you're doing. Keep it up. And if there's ever anything you want me to cover in these videos, please send me a message. I'll be happy to cover it.